So in our last lecture, we focused on the mechanics of the different ratios, and we kind of touched on why we might use the ratios. In this lecture, we're going to focus on applying the ratios. We'll start out by comparing Lowe's and Home Depot. We're interested in investing in Lowe's, but you can't really look at Lowe's without looking at Home Depot, and we'll start from there. Since we're interested in investing, we're going to look at the profitability ratios. We have some actual numbers from recent years for both Lowe's and Home Depot, and we've already put them into the ratios. We're not going to do the calculations. We're going to focus on what the ratios are telling us. So before we do that, let's kind of get some background. We'll do this backwards. Usually you look at the ratios and then you try to figure out why the ratios look a certain way. Let's get some background on these two companies, and then we'll see if the ratios play out. So based on research and some articles where the management of Home Depot and Lowe's were interviewed, it seems that Home Depot has focused more on operational efficiency and supply chain. Home Depot has also been able to get 2 locations faster during their expansion stage, so they were able to get better locations when they were expanding. Professional contractors seem to like Home Depot better. They're part of the sales is about 45% for Home Depot versus 20% of professional contractors. And then we have that Home Depot is perceived to have better brands for sale. Let's see how this looks on their ratios. So we got a couple years for Lowe's, since that's our focus company. We're going to look at a more recent year, which we'll call the current year, and the year before that. And then we'll compare that to Home Depot. And then we'll look at the industry. We have some industry averages too. The first ratio we'll look at is the return on assets. So this is trying to see how much the management is doing with the resources they've been given, right? So managers are given resources, in this case, stores and inventory, and then they are, supposed to take that and turn that into, sales, into returns. So the earnings before interest is the EBI. So we're going to compare the earnings to the assets that the management was given. So the higher the return on assets, the better. We see that currently the Lowe's return on assets is 10% versus the prior year, which is 9.2%. So by looking at a couple of years, you're starting to get an idea of a trend, and they're going in the right direction. We'll compare that to Home Depot. So Home Depot has almost 20% return on assets. Now, this kind of plays into the story that we were fed, saying that they were able to get more efficiency, better locations, better brands. Is Home Depot really knocking it out the park, or is that just average for what should be going on in that home improvement industry anyhow? So when we look at the industry average at 12%, we see that Lowe's is underperforming and Home Depot is doing very well for the home improvement industry. Remember, the return on assets can be broken down, and we can see if it's because of the profit margin or if it's because of the asset turnover. The profit margin tells us if we have differentiation, meaning that we've separated ourselves and made ourselves different enough that we can charge a higher margin. And the asset turnover shows us if we have better operational efficiency. Let's compare both of these for Lowe's, Home Depot, and the industry average. So the profit margin of Lowe's has improved. In other words, they're keeping more money when they make a sale as profit, from 4.6% to 5.1%. When we compare that to their biggest competitor, which is Home Depot, we see that Home Depot is doing much better. That shows that Home Depot has differentiation, right? So they can charge a higher markup. And that could play into our story of perceived better brands. Now, the industry average is about 4.5%, which means that Lowe's is not necessarily underperforming. It's just that Home Depot is doing a better job. Asset turnovers helps us to understand the efficiency. This is the number of times we're turning our assets into sales. Now, Lowe's is, lost a little bit of footing there. They went from 2 times to 1.96 times. The more times you turn over, the better. Now, Home Depot is doing better than either of those. So that means that they do have some operational efficiency. That focus on operational efficiency and supply chain seems to be playing out here too. So they've beat Home Depot on both differentiation and costs. the industry is about what Lowe's is. So Lowe's looks like they're performing around the industry, where Home Depot is performing much better. Looking at return on common equity, this is showing us what the equity investors, people who are investing in the stock, are looking at as a return. So the formula just says to take your net income and then take out any preferred dividends, right? Because preferred dividends go to preferred stockholders, and we're looking at common stockholders. So take out preferred dividends and then divide that by the equity and see what kind of return you have on that equity. So we see Lowe's is improving. They're trending up over 2 years, 7.5% to 8.75%. And we can, if we look at that compared to the industry, we see that they're doing a better job for their stockholders. Home Depot, again, has done a better job than Lowe's. So just looking at the profitability ratios, we can start to get an understanding of the situation. Usually what you do is you look at the ratios and then you look for a story to explain it. In this case, we kind of started out with the story and moved into the ratios to see if the ratios kind of support the story that we were given. Now, I'm also interested in activity ratios. Activity ratios show the ability for management to do a good job in certain areas where activities are concerned. Accounts receivable is an important activity, and so is inventory turnover. Now, the thing that you have to remember is that not all businesses are strong on accounts receivable. Some don't have any accounts receivable. And that's kind of the case for Lowe's and Home Depot. In that industry, people go in, they buy what they want, and they pay for it before they leave. You don't really see accounts receivable as an important part of their core operations. However, it is a key part of some other companies. And so what we're going to do is we're going to shift gears. Instead of using Lowe's and Home Depot, let's shift to the beverage industry. We'll look at 3 businesses that do use these ratios as part. Well, let's just say that these ratios would be an important part of their management's performance. So let's take an overview of these 3 companies. So when we look at Pepsi overall as a parent company is more diversified. That means they have beverages, they have snack foods, etc. Coke has diversity, but only on the beverages, so they're not as diversified as far as the products go compared to Pepsi. Now that could be considered good or bad. It could be considered good if they're more focused on their core strength. And Monster, of course, energy drinks. That's the new kid on the block. Pepsi is decentralized bottling as far as the management is concerned. So managers get to decide on a local level how they want to produce the products. They supposedly know the area better. Whereas the Coke decisions on bottling come from higher up, and they're passed down to those localized areas. Pepsi and Coke are, of course, mature businesses. This means that they've created efficiencies over time, they have great brand recognition, and they're steady cash. Whereas Monster is an emerging business. The good thing about that is that they have room for growth, but they're not as experienced. They don't have the experience on production and supply chains that these mega companies like Pepsi and Coke have. Now, that's the story. Let's see if the ratios kind of play into that. Again, normally you look at the ratios and then look for the story, but we're doing it backwards as we learn about these ratios and how they can help us to see the story. The first ratio we look at is called the accounts receivable turnover. So the way that most of these companies work, like Pepsi and Coke and Monster, is that they have the truck drivers deliver the product is delivered, and then to say a local store or convenience store or wherever, and then the store is invoiced later on. The truck driver doesn't typically pick up the money for the product. So that being said, they have receivables. That's an important part of their business, and we need to see how management reacts to these receivables. Remember, receivables represent a risk for us because we no longer have the beverage that is now at the location of the convenience store or wherever, and we don't have the cash. Now, we're in a good position because we've made the sale, we've delivered, we've done our part, but we're in a risk position until that receivable gets brought in as cash. Now, that being said, we need to see how management is doing with their receivables. That is definitely a key area for for this type of industry. Management's ability to do this is very important. So the accounts receivable turnover ratio takes our credit sales, or whatever sales we're given on our financials. In this case, we did get the credit sales from these companies, and we compare that to the average account receivable. So Pepsi's turned over their receivables 9.6 times, and then this current year 9.3 times, the most recent year we're looking at. So they're kind of going backwards. You should be turning over, the more times turnover, the better. That shows that management lost a little bit of ground. Coke is right in there, about the same, 9.4. And we see the less experienced Monster definitely is missing the mark. They're at 6.8 times on their receivables. And the industry average is about 9 times. So just like we were saying earlier, the more times we turn over the receivables, the better. Companies like Pepsi and Coke have had time to learn to be efficient with receivables, and a company like Monster, being the new kid on the block, they need to learn a few things. Now, the thing about accounts receivable turnover is the number of times doesn't always resonate with the analyst. Sometimes it's better to turn this into the number of days. So the days accounts receivable outstanding is done by just taking that accounts receivable turnover ratio and putting it in the formula with the number of days in the year. So that way we get a number of days to collect, and sometimes that just makes more sense to the user. We always like to see receivables getting paid within 30 days. We see we're not too far off though for Pepsi and Coke. Both of them are under 40 days. Monster is much higher at 54 days. And the industry average is much closer to Coke and Pepsi. So we got a kind of a good feeling now for how these companies are dealing with this part of their operation, which is getting the receivables turned into cash. They also are dealing with inventory, so that's definitely a key part of their business. Not every business has inventory. You wouldn't look at inventory ratio for, say, the airline industry, because they don't really have they don't really have inventory as part of their core operations. Instead, you would look at other ratios. For Pepsi and Coke and Monster, though, their whole reason for being is to provide inventory, manufacture inventory to provide to the customers. The ratio takes cost of goods sold and divides it by average inventory. The more times you turn your inventory over, the better. And we see that Pepsi is doing a much better job turning their inventory over than Coca-Cola. Now, they've lost a little ground between the prior year and the current year. However, they're doing much better than Coca-Cola and Monster too. And they're even beating the industry. So this might play into the story about how Pepsi is diversified and allowing the management at a local level to make decisions about what people around there want to drink or want to eat as snacks. So that might be the part of the story that works with this ratio. Whereas the Coca-Cola and Monster products, perhaps they're more centralized decision making, and so they're not able to hone into the wants of the local area. So the number of times you turn over, that tells us something. I mean, it's very useful, but if we can look at the number of days something is held in inventory, oftentimes that just resonates better with the analyst. So you can see Pepsi is keeping its products on the shelves about 35, 36 days, and Coke is much longer, 73 days, and then Monster 61. Now the industry shows that Pepsi's beating the industry, and Coke and Monster are definitely lagging behind. So this kind of now gives us a feel for that ratio. I mean, all these ratios are just numbers until we put them into perspective, right? Now we're going to look at the liquidity ratios. Now, liquidity ratios are more in line with what creditors are interested in. We'll stick with the beverage industry just so we don't shift back and forth. And two of the key areas for liquidity to look at are the current ratio and the quick ratio, and these are related ratios. These ratios show us the ability to get cash that's enough to cover our current obligations. So the current assets are the the assets that we expect to be cash within a year, and the current liabilities are the liabilities or obligations we expect to have to pay within a year. So if these work out, we'll have more current assets than current liabilities, and that shows us that we're a lower risk for being able to meet our obligations. The current ratio is looked at as a 1:1 ratio, right? So in other words, how many dollars do you have in current assets compared to $1 in current liabilities? So in the case for Pepsi, the most recent year was 1.2 to 1. So they had $1.20 for every dollar in current liability. So they had more current assets that were coming in within a year than the current liabilities. And the higher that ratio is, the better. Coke is kind of in the middle there at 1.3 to 1, and Monster is doing much better. They have a lot more current assets than current liabilities. That shows that they're not using obligations, they're not using loans and liabilities in order to get the cash that they need. So they have 4 to 1. So that's much better. The industry is about what Pepsi and Coke are. Although the current ratio is a great ratio for helping us understand short-term risk, the quick ratio is even better if you're really looking at if things were to really go south, right? If things were really go bad, the quick ratio is a really good ratio because it takes out things that are really not anything to do with cash, such as prepaid expenses, which will never turn into cash, and something like inventory, which we will turn into cash, but we can't depend on it. Now, cash, short-term investments, and receivables, we can depend on those much better. So when we take those out, you'll normally notice that they'll be much lower than 1. So for the current year for Pepsi, it did go down. It went from 1.5 to 1.3. I have a typo here. That should be 0.9. Sorry about that. And so you'll notice that the quick ratio is lower for the prior year for Pepsi. It's lower for Coca-Cola, and it's lower for Monster because what we've done is we've taken out the inventory from the equation and we've taken out any prepaid expenses. And that really gives us a better idea. Now, most of these are either over 1 or close to 1, and that's a really good sign for the quick ratio because if things really went bad, they could get access to the cash faster with these really quick current assets than having to wait for inventory to be sold and obviously not having probably any luck trying to get prepaid expenses. The last group of ratios we're going to look at is the solvency ratios. Now, solvency has to do with the ability for the business to be around for the long haul, right? The long term. So one of the best ratios to look at is the debt to assets. So this will be all your liabilities over all your assets. And so liabilities being obligations, we're looking at the ability in the long run for us to be able to cover those liabilities. So the lower the percentage, the better off we are as far as risk is concerned for our obligations. So this is, in other words, this is how we financed our assets. That we financed them through debt, being the liabilities, or equity. And we see that Coca-Cola and Pepsi, both being above, close to 80% or above 80%, they really focused on obligations, liabilities in order to cover their debt. Monster did not. Monster is focused more on the equity side and has a lower percentage of debt to the assets. In the industry, they're more like 75%. So Monster's got lower long-term risk. However, because Pepsi and Coke enjoy such great brand recognition and such long-term efficiencies, that's probably why they went with the obligations versus equity in order to finance the assets. Monster, on the other hand, being the new kid on the block, in order to reduce their potential risk, they did go with more of the investments to get the resources they need, the assets. And so this bodes well for all three companies. The longer term organizations like Pepsi and Coke are able to support a bigger amount of debt financing. Monster, being a new kid on the block, has really covered its bases by lowering its debt financing, and that shows that Monster, is definitely on the right track. So what we did with this lecture was take the stories and look at the ratios. and see if the ratios play into the stories, and they did for the most part. Now, typically when you're analyzing a business, what you do is you take the ratios, you take those ratios, and then you see, well, what can we explain it by doing some research into what's going on with those companies. We did it backwards just so we could get a feel for how these ratios work and how we can see the impact of management decisions on the business through the ratios.